All right, we're live. Howdy, everybody. My name is Roy Arthur Blodgett, and I will be your host today for this webinar about ultraviolet and visible light. And I'm really excited to dive into this topic. It's a really deep, layered one with really profound implications in terms of how we keep our reptiles. But before we dive into that, I want to give a shout out to Happy Dragons for making this webinar series possible. And I really want to encourage everyone to go and join the Happy Dragons Discord. You'll see a link for that in the video chat. But that's a great place to just join a community of like-minded, reptile and amphibian keepers who are seeking to provide the best for their animals, always seeking to learn more, and who are also just like a bunch of sweethearts and really helpful people. So highly recommend everyone go join there and get involved with the community. And with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and dive into today's topic, which is ultraviolet and visible light. So I've got a presentation here. We'll go through and we'll do our usual thing. Oh, before we dive into that, really quick, Phil, my handsome, dashing co-host of Project Herpetoculture and dear friend, was supposed to join us here today, but he's not feeling well. He's a bit under the weather, so he couldn't be here. But just wanted to let everybody know that's what's going on with Phil. Everyone send him your love and healing vibes. Hopefully he'll be back for the next one. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get into it. Okay, so Herpetoculture Fundamentals, UV and Visible Light, presented by myself today. So few subjects in herpetoculture have elicited more impassioned opinions and heated discourse than the applications of ultraviolet and visible light for captive herpetofauna. And some have argued that providing UV and visible light is not necessary for the long-term well-being of some species, and they'll cite breeding successes or other accomplishments as sufficient evidence for this assertion. However, the scholarship on the subject is not ambiguous at all. And from all the considered evidence available to us, it's clear that all herpetofauna benefit from the application of UV and visible light when it's provided appropriately. And so this is what we're going to be exploring today. So given that the focus of this series is to explore science-based husbandry with an emphasis on improving animal welfare, we're far less concerned with what captive herpetofauna need in terms of minimum standards, but rather what is proven to improve the conditions of captive herpetofauna. So as such, we'll proceed under the understanding that carefully providing UV and visible light is good practice based on the available evidence. So often you'll hear, this question of like, okay, but do snakes really need UV or do they need visible light? And some will argue, they can survive without it. But again, we're not so much concerned about like need in terms of these baseline minimum standards. What we're looking for is, do they benefit? Does it improve their welfare? And that's the metric that is driving our approach. So given that we know they benefit, given what we know when we provide these things appropriately, it improves the welfare of our animals. That is all we need to know to explore how to provide it. But why is providing ultraviolet and visible light important? And what do these wavelengths provide for our reptiles? Let's have a look. First, let's briefly have a look at the electromagnetic spectrum and the wavelengths represented by ultraviolet and visible light, which alongside infrared, which we spoke about in our last webinar, make up the solar spectrum. So ultraviolet represents the range of wavelengths from approximately 280 nanometers to about 400 nanometers. And visible light represents the wavelength from 400 nanometers to approximately 700. So you can see them in this, this spectrum of the electromagnetic spectrum. It's a pretty small actual range of wavelengths, but it's vastly important. So as we discussed in our previous lecture on infrared, herpetofauna have evolved to exploit the radiation of the solar spectrum to facilitate various bodily functions. Just as the infrared spectrum enables thermoregulation and a bunch of other important functions, ultraviolet and visible light are equally essential, but for other functions. And perhaps best known among herp keepers is the importance of ultraviolet, which can be subdivided into UVB and UVA, or even further than that if you want to get really granular. You can talk about UVA1, UVA2. But regardless, UV is essential for its role in vitamin D3 synthesis, and it also supports immune system function and management, including management of bacterial and fungal threats. It has a relationship to egg development, and there are a whole host of other benefits. UVA in particular also plays a really important role in the color vision of herpetofauna. So while human beings, we just see the visible light spectrum, a lot of herpetofauna can actually see, their vision is actually broader than the visible light spectrum. And they can see into ultraviolet. And if you think about species with loreal pits or labial pits, heat sensing pits, like some of the pythons and boas and rattlesnakes, pit vipers, they actually can see essentially into the infrared spectrum as well, because those heat sensing pits are connected to their visual system. Meanwhile, visible light plays an essential role in regulating hormonal balance and circadian rhythms, alongside a myriad of other benefits, including kind of skin deep thermoregulation and communication between conspecifics. The intensity of visible light also represents a primary indicator for herpetofauna in selecting for their basking sites. This is really important, and we'll get to this more later. So, how do we best provide these spectra in the vivarium setting? Let's discuss it. To best provide a high quality of ultraviolet and visible light in the vivarium setting, we have to utilize multiple fixtures in combination to provide a broad spectrum of light. So just like in our conversation about infrared, there's just no all-in-one bulb that just does everything we want. What we have to do is instead kind of piecemeal together different types of bulbs which produce different wavelengths to try and provide a broad spectrum that replicates the sun. And in most cases, as it relates to ultraviolet and visible light, this is going to be achieved by the use of pairing T5 high output fluorescent bulbs alongside bright, powerful LEDs. And we're going to talk now about selecting the appropriate UV T5 bulb, which can often be really intimidating for folks. It can lead to a lot of questions, and it is kind of a bit of a clunky process. You have to put together a lot of different information about your animal. You have to learn a bit about your animal's natural history. So we're going to go into it. So first, you'll need to have an understanding of your herp's natural history. So the region and habitat where your herp naturally occurs is what's going to determine the appropriate ultraviolet index, or UVI, to provide in the vivarium context, and ultimately the bulb that corresponds to. So in thinking about this, the Ferguson zones are a really helpful index to consider. And the Ferguson zones are essentially, it's an index that was created by Gary Ferguson, who basically established that there are different categories essentially of reptiles in terms of the ways that they interact with their environment, the ways they interact with ultraviolet radiation in their environment. And he then corresponded those to a reasonable UV index reading to apply within the captive environment. And so, Ferguson Zone 1, which has a UV index reading of about 0.4 to 0.7, would correspond to shade-dwelling species or crepuscular species. Whereas if you go all the way up to like a Ferguson Zone 4, you're at a 2.6 to 3.5 plus UVI. That's going to apply to like midday basking species. So think of like your arid agamid species, like your amastics and stuff like that. And the best quality bulbs are manufactured to achieve relatively consistent UVIs at specific distances. So Zoomed, Arcadia, and Exoterra has a new very high output T5 that they've just released. These are all manufacturers with good options for achieving that. And usually they'll have manufacturer labeling that will suggest what UVI will be provided at different distances from the bulb. So once you've established an idea of the appropriate UVI for your herp, you've done some research, you've determined, okay, my species, maybe you keep something like a polychrus, like the monkey lizards that I work with. These guys are um, kind of just below midday baskers. So I'd say they're Ferguson zone 3. They're not going to be fully out, they're not in like arid environments. They're in tropical environments that are a little bit less intense UVIs outside, but they still spend a lot of time openly basking. So once you know that, you're empowered with that information, you can then go about setting up the correct bulb and the correct basking zone distance from that bulb for your reptile. And to do this, it's really helpful to have a tool called a solar meter. The solar meter 6.5R is a great option. And these are kind of pricey. They're a couple $100, $300. But it's one of those tools that if you can make the investment in it, it will pay dividends in the long term, because you can use it not only to help establish how you're setting up your bulbs and ensuring from like real-time data that it's the appropriate UVI for your animal. You're also able to track the kind of degradation of the bulb over time. So as we all know, T5 high output bulbs, they slowly degrade over time. The quality of UV that they produce degrades over time. Most of them are good for about a year, but it really depends on the manufacturer and it depends on the bulb. And it's really helpful to have, again, real-time data to determine where that bulb is. In my case, it's actually saved me money because I'll find that sometimes those bulbs are good for 18 months or something like that. And whereas if I hadn't known that, I might have replaced it at 9 months. That said, if you don't have a solar meter or you can't afford to invest in one right away, you can also follow the manufacturer labels as a guide to establish your basking distance. So on the screen, you'll see next to the solar meter image there is one of these manufacturer label images. This is for one of those new Exoterra very high output T5s. And you can see it's got, it's basically a graph charting the distance from the bulb and the corresponding UVI that you can expect to achieve. But regardless of whether you're setting it up with the guide, the manufacturer guide, or you're using a solar meter, it's always important to remember to set up a gradient to be sure that you have options for your animal to escape the UV completely if it so desires. And maybe even the option to get a little bit higher on the UVI than you might initially expect. So I'm not saying you want to give your animal an access to like a UVI of like a 7 if it's a midday basker, but you might want to give it a UVI of like, you might allow it to get up to maybe a 4 or a 4.5, something like that. And again, what you're seeking to do in that is to empower choice in your animal. What we're doing is we're trusting our animals to be able to self-regulate within safe boundaries. We're kind of setting the playing field, and then we're trusting them to play the game appropriately from there, so to speak. So that's a little bit about visible light, how to set it up using T5 high output, or ultraviolet, I'm sorry. But moving on to visible light. High power LEDs typically are going to provide the best desired intensity of light for your visible light. And there are a variety of good options to explore in that regard. You can look into high quality plant lights, to reptile branded products such as the Arcadia LED Jungle Dawn line. This is like a great application for if you're going to join that Discord. Like go into the lighting section, ask the other folks in the Discord, like what kind of LED lights are you utilizing for your reptiles, and just see what people will say. Because people have different kind of preferences according to, their needs, their animals' needs, and also just their own personal, again, preferences. And that could be a really helpful way to kind of explore, because there's an abundance of options in this regard. And in terms of importance, visible light is probably the most overlooked aspect of the solar spectrum as it relates to herpetoculture. I often find that there's kind of a hierarchy that gets placed around animal lighting with, kind of your infrared and your UV kind of being placed at a greater level of importance than visible light, when really they're all equally important, but for really different reasons, because they meet, again, different needs for your animals. And visible light, it's something that has been kind of better understood in recent years, thanks to experimentation from some reptile lighting experts such as Roman Murin. And to illustrate that, we can think about how reptiles have evolved, right, to utilize sunlight. And sunlight contains all the wavelengths of the solar spectrum at once. And that the intensity of the light that it produces is going to far overpower any of our bulbs that we're utilizing for reptiles. And how this relates to then captive conditions is to consider that, like, very often reptiles, because again they're responding to this all-in-one light of sunlight in nature, they're often going to prioritize basking based on the intensity of the light that's available to them. And so in the vivarium context, this usually means favoring the LEDs, which will produce the most intense light and which boast greater power density when compared to something like a halogen or an incandescent or a T5. So because those LEDs are so much brighter, they're so much more intense, very often, especially kind of like midday basking species will choose to bask wherever that LED is, even if, say, that LED is not paired well with a UV or a halogen. And so we'll further explore the implications of that in our next webinar, where we'll have more time. But it's something that I wanted to note now, just to kind of plant that seed. So what about UV emitting LEDs? This is kind of a new thing that we're all navigating and considering in herpetoculture, because for a very long time, UV emitting LEDs just didn't exist. But really within the last like 5 years, several brands have emerged. And we have this rapid progress of efficient LED technology that has occurred, and corresponding to that, there's this increasing global trend of regulation on lighting to prioritize energy efficiency. And so, standard household incandescents and stuff like that have been banned in many jurisdictions in favor of LEDs, which produce, they produce a lot more light in terms of lumens, in terms of PAR than incandescents would, but they're also more efficient, which is the best of both worlds in some ways. And, several reptile brands have sought to capitalize on that by combining the powerful visible light benefits of LEDs alongside UV emitting LED diodes to provide a 2-in-1 light. And of course, like in theory, this is a great idea, right? Because wow, it would be so nice to not have to have a T5 and an LED. It would be so great if I could just have an LED and it did everything. As this Yarrow spiny lizard is saying, it's like, I would like to have it all. However, in practice, the current suite of UV emitting LEDs are limited in the spectra that they provide. And that has potentially harmful consequences on captive herpetofauna. So essentially, as we understand UV wavelengths, there is both across the spectrum of the wavelengths, there's both the accelerator, essentially, for the vitamin D3 synthesization process, and the brakes. They're all incorporated across that spectrum. And a lot of the UV LEDs are heavily weighted in the direction of the acceleration and lacking in the direction of the brakes. And there are very valid concerns, and there's also some scholarly evidence to support that this is already occurring. This can lead to hypervitaminosis in our reptiles and other potentially harmful consequences. And so, that said, there are some UV LEDs currently on the market which do provide really excellent UVA wavelengths, and these do have noteworthy benefits, particularly as it relates to our reptiles' color vision. Excuse me. But at this point, none of the UV LEDs that are currently marketed as, an all-in-one option are actually considered safe to use as a primary source of UVB at this stage of development. There are potential use cases for these UV LEDs alongside, say, a T5 UVB bulb. But again, that's kind of defeating the purpose, right? Because if you're already getting the spectrum that is desired from the T5, you may not need this UV LED. Again, the best use case is to utilize UV LEDs alongside a T5, and then you can get kind of those UVA benefits. You can turn off the UVB production of some of these LEDs, and that could be a good potential use case. Excuse me. Okay, so that's enough of that for now. Our next webinar is going to discuss blending the spectra produced by our various bulbs and creating a practical lighting layout to maximize their effectiveness for the animals in our care. So stay tuned on that. And from there, I again want to give the same acknowledgments I gave last time about our reptile lighting experts, Roman Murin, Thomas Griffiths, Dr. Francis Bain, Serena Wunderlich. And I want to encourage people to check out the Reptile Lighting Group on Facebook, as well as that lighting section in the Happy Dragons Discord, to just chat with other keepers about how they're approaching all of this and how they're meeting the needs of their animals. And I want to thank you for listening to the presentation section of this. We're going to dive into the Q&A. Before we do, you can check out, this is our socials for me and also for Phil. If you want to follow along, check us out on Instagram, Facebook, Patreon, or our website, and also our podcast. So that is that. Let's dive into the other stuff. Oh, okay. So I'm going to go over to our live stream questions. And if anyone has any questions, for further elaboration on any of this stuff, if anything was unclear, please let me know in the questions and we'll get to it. And also on the back end, we have Savannah, who's producing today. Huge shout out to Savannah, who makes all this possible. And Savannah is also a lighting wizard who could provide a lot of helpful insights. So let's get into it. Okay, so mercury vapor bulbs. This is an interesting one. Gosh, I'm sorry. I need to get some water, I think. But there's also mercury vapor bulbs and metal halides or HID lamps. And these also have good use cases. But I tend to see a lot of people prioritizing, again, rather than utilizing a mercury vapor bulb, which does produce, it does produce visible light to some extent. It produces heat to some extent, and it produces UV. But we find that it provides a fuller spectrum or a broader spectrum. I hesitate to ever use the term full spectrum when I'm discussing reptile lighting. I see that term thrown around a lot, but the reality is we can't provide a full spectrum in the sense that the sun can, right? So what we can do is provide a broad spectrum. And I find that the combination of utilizing these other lamps in conjunction with one another is a fuller spectrum than providing a mercury vapor bulb or a metal halide. That said, lighting is kind of a smorgasbord. And so if you want to provide a mercury vapor bulb in addition, or a metal halide in addition to that, that could be a beneficial use case. And there are, again, others who might feel differently. Some people, I know a lot of European keepers in particular really love metal halide bulbs. They produce really high quality light. It produces heat and UV, and they're very bright and intense. But again, it's kind of a personal preferencing on some level. Savannah, do you want to add anything on that in the chat? And also, Savannah has added an additional question. What are your thoughts on the new UVA lamps? So there's a new UVA lamp on the market called the Phonolux True Chroma, I believe is what it's called. And I think that these are manufactured, or at least the brand is out of the UK, if I understand correctly. And these seem like an amazing option. Like I said earlier, they provide the benefits of a UV LED crossover without the concerns about the UVB component and the potential hypervitaminosis. And from what I understand, the initial testing from the lighting experts like Thomas Griffiths, among others, about the Phonolux True Chroma is that it's a fantastic bulb to utilize alongside a halogen, and again something else to provide more visible light. So those are my thoughts on that. It does seem that bulb is what's really special about those bulbs is that they're designed to prioritize the actual vision of reptiles. It's designed with the reptile vision in mind, and so it's perhaps the first light that is able to accurately cater to the way that reptile vision has evolved, which is a really profound implication, and it's something that I'm actually really curious to try. I think that I'll speak a little bit more to those in our next webinar as well, talking about layout, how I would use those in terms of a layout alongside a halogen and the other bulbs to, again, meet this whole broad spectrum intention. So Savannah says that metal halides are wonderful, but they don't have good longevity for UVB. So the UVB can essentially where it can degrade over time, as I spoke to earlier. And that makes sense because it's this bulb that's producing a lot of heat. And we do know that when our ultraviolet, when like our T5 fluorescent bulbs get too hot, that also tends to expedite the degradation process. That said, after that loss, the UVA is still really good, and the heat is still really good that's produced by those. But they do also have this like longer burn-in period. So the burn-in period is kind of the initial period of once you've got that light turned on. Sometimes it can take hours to days for that bulb to fully burn in and actually kind of settle into its spectrum, if that makes sense. So Kristen has asked, in terms of visible light, would any broad spectrum LED lights that are used for plant terrariums work, or do reptile branded ones have additional benefits in some way? In terms of visible light, I would say that a lot of the plant terrarium lights can work. I tend to avoid lights that have like lots of different colors in their chip diodes. But a lot of plant lights don't have that. They're more focused on bright white light diodes. Typically, what I'm looking for is a range of diodes in around 6,500 Kelvin color temperature, and then the highest lumen I can get from those lights, which is just the brightest light possible. A lot of the reptile branded ones are basically the same technology as the plant lights, but some of them are just kind of overpowered in a sense. Like I remember when for example, the Arcadia Jungle Dawn LED bars first emerged on the scene. It was kind of like this big moment because they just create such a profound amount of light. Um, but it's essentially the same technology. So yeah, as Savannah's saying here, they work just as well and sometimes are even better, assuming they're that broad spectrum. But they could also even cost more than the reptile branded ones, which for some people that's fine, right? But and Savannah's also asked, can you explain more on how heating and UV lighting go hand in hand? That's kind of what I'm going to be speaking to more in the next webinar. I guess I could speak to it a little bit now, but essentially, and this will be again the subject of the next webinar in more depth. But what we're seeking to do is overlap these different forms of light, these different the spectra created by our different bulbs, and so the best way to do that is to consider how we're approaching our lighting layout when we're setting everything up, and make sure that the beam, the essentially light beam, is overlapping sufficiently. Um, and I think that that's probably what you mean, Savannah, when you say that, how they go hand in hand. And again, that's why it's important to like consider the placement of your LEDs in conjunction with your UV and your heat, because again, because they're often overpowered in terms of that power density concept, that light intensity concept. um, they can, if you have your LED opposite on the other side of the enclosure that then of your UV and halogen bulbs, your reptile might actually instinctively choose to bask under the LED and not receive the benefit of these other bulbs. And then what size and length should the visible LED and UVB lights each be relative to enclosure size? So this is a really fantastic question and something I think about a lot. And there's a couple different approaches you can take to this. So this is again something I'll be discussing in more depth in the next webinar. But basically, a lot of people will approach it. They'll try and find fixtures that cover the broadest distance across the vivarium possible, and then so they'll create a really broad area of visible light and UV. And then what they'll do to create the gradient and help to enforce that gradient is they'll incorporate a lot of cover within the vivarium to allow the animals to move under objects, under plants, under foliage, that kind of thing, to essentially avoid the exposure as desired, and to thermoregulate. And that tends to be most often the approach that I personally use. That said, it's equally valid to instead choose, to select fixtures that are, say, half the length of the vivarium, and designate a specific kind of basking zone, so to speak. Because I am really interested in creating gradients, and I like to give my animals the option to say, perhaps they want to bask under the UV or the visible light, but they're actually not really wanting to be underneath the wavelength of the halogen. That is why I provide those broader fixtures, because it'll allow me to say, okay, over here, the reptile can get all three. They can get visible light, they can get infrared, and they can get UV. Or they can shift a little bit over to the right or the left, and they can get a little bit of UV and visible light, but without the infrared if they desire it. But again, this is up to personal preference, and is also, I think, it helps to know your animal, and their particular habits and their ecology, their natural history, and determine from there. So I hope that was clear. Yeah, and this is also a really important point that Savannah just added, and that's to remember that when it comes to like the length of the lamp, especially if you're considering like a T5, a fluorescent tube, the highest output of that lamp is going to be in the center of that fixture, or the center of that bulb. So that's a really helpful thing to consider if you are going to be exploring layout. Is there anything that you would add on that, Sav? Of course, my pleasure, Kirsten. Thanks for the question. And I'm gonna get a PDF of this presentation created and put into the chat for everybody to use as desired. All right. Any other questions, thoughts? Welcome, Shira. I'm glad you're here. No worries about being late to the party. We've just been getting into the nitty gritty, as is always fun to do. Yeah, please watch the replay, and I would love your feedback too, Shira, because I know that this is a subject that you have done a really amazing job explaining and exploring. So, um, as this is something that's kind of an iterative process, hopefully I'm going to be giving these presentations again in the future and improving on them. So I always welcome feedback. That goes for everybody who watches these. See if I can get this file uploaded so I can add it. All right, there it goes. It's uploading. And I'll drop the link here shortly. Thanks, Shira. I appreciate that. Sav, is there anything that you feel is missing from this today that we've gone over so far that you would want to explore in more detail? I really trust your discernment on this subject, so I'd love to hear. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the feedback. And yeah, Project Herpetoculture, just so everybody knows, it's not gone for good. We're going to be returning with new episodes, hopefully pretty soon. We are actively working on that, recording and moving in that direction, which we're really excited about. So, really appreciate the support from the folks that have listened to the podcast and tuned in from there. Thanks, Sav. Yeah, there's a part 3, Shira. So part 3 is going to be talking about kind of blending the spectra, as I like to say. So how we lay out our lighting. I had originally considered, maybe I'll just include that in this webinar, but I actually think it's enough of an important subject that it warrants its own webinar. And so I'm going to be doing that one next, hopefully here in just a couple weeks. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to give it a couple more minutes here. If there are questions before we sign off, I'm sorry about my coughing fit. I'm not sure why that happened today, but I should have brought water and I forgot this time. So now I know to never do it again. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Don't forget to like and subscribe, everybody. Thanks, Shira. We do really appreciate that. Oh, this isn't UV or visible light, but can you explain why some lamps break quickly? I'm not sure. Specifically incandescent. Are we talking about like when we're using our hands? to install them. I think that this may be what you're hinting at, but if I am off, then please let me know in the chat. But it is true that, yeah, some bulbs will burn out quickly or break quickly, particularly incandescents and halogens, and that tends to be they tend to be prone to doing that if we use our hands without gloves when we're installing them, because essentially, like, the oils from our fingers can condense on those bulbs and cause them to burn out more quickly. So for this reason, I always recommend when people are changing out their bulbs or installing new bulbs, um, um, to use gloves or like a towel, something like that, to kind of create a barrier there. And yeah, so you're speaking to using heat lamps last month that last maybe only a month or two, and sometimes the filament immediately break fixture issue. Honestly, I think that might be quality control issue from bulbs. I've had that too with some bulbs, some brands worse than others. Um, and what I think that's what I attribute it to, not the actual fixture, but it could be a fixture issue as well. I think that, I mean, those are the two major factors to consider, right? Is like fixture and bulb. And in my experience, I think it's typically bulbs, because I'll have like a fixture where I'll use the same fixture and maybe a bulb will last 9 months, and then I'll replace it and that one lasts for like a month before it burns out. One thing I wanted to mention on these is that there are the new Reptile Systems Eco Halogens. And they seem like a really amazing option, because it's like you purchase the bulb and the housing of the bulb, but you can actually replace the filaments as they burn out. And I know that Phil has been using them for like a really long time now, and he says that the filaments on those have been like amazing. They've lasted a really long time. And it's so cool that you can actually replace just the filament rather than throwing away the whole bulb. You can just buy a replacement filament. So that's kind of in my opinion, kind of a groundbreaking thing. And especially just because I hate like just the waste component of just throwing away so many bulbs. I've always been interested in the Zoom Ed Nano lamps, but haven't heard great things. Wasn't sure if the fixture of the lamp was the issue. I think that the lamps aren't great. So I actually do use nano halogens a lot for my rearing enclosures. So these ones over to my right here, I guess my left on the screen, they are great, I think, for providing, again, the benefits of a halogen, but in a smaller enclosure. But I haven't used, or the Zoom Ed branded ones that I've bought they've just been pretty poor quality. And so I've bought a bunch of other little nano halogens, and they've worked great for me. I think that some of the other brands I've used AnyRay, I think, is one of the brands, or Satco is another one. And I think that the style of the nano halogens I use, I think they're called MR16s. So they're a standard like E26 or E27 screw type bulb, rather than I think they're called GU10s, which are like two little prongs. Although I think that Zilla makes a fixture for those kind. I haven't tried them, so I can't speak to how well they work. But I think that I know a lot of people are not fans of nano halogens, but I think that they're absolutely great use cases for them. Yeah, a bunch of different ones from different brands. Same here. It's kind of a bit complicated in that respect. All right, looks like this file is uploaded. So I'm going to get that ready here to share. Oh no, an error is occurring, of course. Well, maybe I will follow up and post it in the comments on the YouTube version. Yeah, that's exactly why I like to use the nanos as well, is because of how short they are. Having stacked enclosures and external lighting, it does take up so much space, right? It's like I'd rather that space was or that volume was given to the animals, right, rather than to the lighting. But of course, the way a lot of people approach that is to just have the lighting internal in the enclosures, and I really don't like doing that either for obvious reasons. I think it creates a whole bunch of other issues. So I'm pro external lighting, and I really love the nanos because it does help to keep things more streamlined. So you can actually see that, like, again, in the setups to my right there, that there's not actually a ton of wasted space between those stacks of enclosures, and yet they still have LEDs, UV, and halogen overhead light, which is my goal, is to provide that for everything here. Yeah, nano halogen for the tarantula, of course. That's a great application for one of those. Yeah, and I love that too. This point that Shira just made about, like, you can have two nanos inside to cover more area, which I also totally recommend for a lot of folks. It's like, I actually, in a lot of cases, I would prefer to have, like, say, two 25-watt nanos right next to each other rather than like one 50-watt or 35-watt, larger standard halogen, because it can actually create a broader basking area for the animal. Savannah says, that's awesome. I'm going to look into them. Maybe I'll give it a go. Destined to fail. I don't know, Savannah. It doesn't look like there's a lot of failure happening over with what you're doing. It kind of looks like a lot of awesome success to me. So, and I just dropped the drive link in the chat. Hopefully that works. That's just to the PDF. Everything, Savannah breaks everything software related, so it doesn't have faith in hardware. That's totally reasonable. I can actually relate to that. I don't know if you've noticed, but I have this whole relationship to technical difficulties, which may have to do with why you're producing this and not me. So, yeah, we can relate. Don't see a link from me. Ack. Oh no, I can see it. I don't know why it's otherwise invisible. Put it here too. See if this works. I don't know. Regardless, I'll make sure that it's in the YouTube description when this gets uploaded. All right. So any kind of last questions or concerns or thoughts that anyone wants to share regarding this subject of UV and visible light? Aha. Looks like Savannah has successfully shared it. Thank you, Savannah. All right. Well, I think that's probably. Oh, needs access. Let me make it. accessible. Okay, it should be anyone with the link can now access it. So hopefully that works. If not, I may need to generate a new link, which I can do. Classic Google Drive, I know. And I actually did select anyone with the link, but it doesn't like me. What can I say? Hopefully that's good now. Hey, my pleasure. Yeah, thank you so much for lurking and learning. That's the good stuff. I really appreciate you tuning in. Yeah, I appreciate everybody who's tuned in and everyone who will tune in the future. When this gets uploaded to YouTube, hopefully we can share the link out there. And yeah, again, this is one of those subjects that's just it's so layered and it can get so complicated. And when I'm seeking to make these presentations, I'm really seeking to try and synthesize the information and make it, kind of like streamlined and accessible to folks. And so it's really easy to like overlook certain aspects or, kind of gloss over certain aspects in that. And it's not out of an intention to like, to not give anything the needed attention, but it's to try not to overload with too much information because it's a lot. So again, I hope it's helpful for folks. And I remain, as always, super available to talk about this kind of stuff with anybody. If you have questions, you can email me at wellspringherp@gmail.com, or you can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, that kind of thing. On Instagram, I'm at wellspringherp. Facebook, Roy Arthur Blodgett, and you can send me a message there with any questions or clarifications. Or if you're just like, stuck on something related to husbandry, I love helping folks out with stuff like that. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you, everyone. Okay. I think we're going to call it a night. But again, thanks to everyone who tuned in. And stay tuned for the next one where we're going to be talking about kind of putting everything together from the last two webinars. And from there, there's going to be more. I'm really into this herpetoculture fundamentals series. I'm really trying to kind of essentially kind of create a curriculum for herpetoculture. And this has been a really productive outlet for me to explore that. So a lot more content to come. And I really appreciate everybody who tunes in and makes it possible. And I really appreciate all the questions. It really provides so much more for these webinars. So have a good night, everybody. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you soon.